Good morning. We do a little something different for a video today because today is Shabbat or Sabbath. Um, I am currently filming in the gym of my apartment complex, so I may have to cut the video short if anybody shows up or anything like that. Uh, so before I get into what the video is mainly going to be about today, I just want to bring up one thing that happened this week. Robert Lee, ESPN, removed him from announcing a game in Charlottesville, Virginia, a college football game, because of his name. They were concerned that if people heard that Robert Lee was announcing the game, that some may become offended and blast their news network for allowing somebody with the name that happened to be the same as a Confederate general to announce a football game. Robert Lee is an Asian American. He did not serve in the Civil War. He was not a general in the Civil War. And he does not appear to be attempting to form a civil war. But I could be wrong that last part. There's absolutely no evidence of it. Nobody's claiming such. So it seems we now live in a day and age where a person is guilty not by association, not because of anything that they've done or said, not because of anything that they're accused of doing or said, but simply because they share a name that happens to be the same as another historical figure. It's as hard as it is to keep a straight face, and as much as I'm trying to hold back laughter at the idiocy of such a thing, it is very sad that a person's career could be affected simply because their parents chose their first name and a last name that nobody really in today's society has much influence over. The very notion that he would have to change a family name that he's probably had for generations is ridiculous. I think ESPN made a really bad decision there. I think it would have been very easy to defend their decision to let him announce the game, to defend their employee if anyone had complained that he was announcing the game because of his name. Very easy to say he wasn't in the Civil War. It's very easy to say he didn't own slaves. It's very easy to say that he never burned down a city, that he's not guilty of any war crimes. It's very easy to prove those things. And I think it's very sad that we live in a day and age that would go that far. But today's the Sabbath, so I'm not going to go into a huge rant about it or really go into any other political topics today. I just wanted to do a quick video this morning because I haven't done one for a couple days. I also want to just kind of tell you guys a little bit about my beliefs. I do associate a lot with the Messianic community. I know a lot of people don't really know what that is. We have the vision that the church tells us about the Messianic community. And, we have a lot of groups within the Messianic community that, represent it according to what they believe it should be or what it is to them. But there's not really a whole lot out there about what it really is. I'm personally kind of more centered between the Messianic community and the Christian community. And I know that will probably disappoint a lot of my friends who are Messianic, and I already know it disappoints a lot of my friends who are Christian. Christians don't seem to tolerate Messianic beliefs very much because of what pastors do say the Messianic belief is. If you were to ask your pastor about the Messianic belief, you'd hear that most likely you'd hear, and if you Google it, you find a lot of Christian sites claiming that it is a cult. And the reason for that is because of the Christian opposition to the Old Testament law. It's very sad that, in Christianity, that we would take our brothers and sisters who may share a single difference or a few differences and immediately discredit them, that we immediately outcast them, that we call them a cult, just because we disagree with a few things. The Messianic community believes in salvation just like we do. They believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross, that he rose again, that he is the Son of God. Some are Trinitarian, some are not. But it's the same thing in Christianity. There are Trinitarian Christians, there are non-Trinitarian Christians. It's a huge debate in Christianity as well. They simply believe that God never changes. The Bible says that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so they believe that his law establishes who he is, that it still holds symbology of prophecy to come. And they believe that as the law was instituted for us, as his bride, to prepare ourselves to be like him, that we do that in obedience to the law, that obeying the law allows us to show our love for him, to be more like him, and allows us to keep ourselves fully aware of the future events to come. That's why they hold the 7 feasts still. They still see the 7 feasts as symbolic of future events. They believe that these feasts will continue to be followed after Christ returns to the earth, and they hold them in preparation for when Christ reestablishes them, so that they'll already know how the feasts are performed, that they can perform them loyally and perfectly for him. If anything, it shows their love for him, that they're trying to prepare themselves for him. Is the law for today? Yes and no. The New Testament is very clear that a lot of the law is not for today. But the New Testament is also very clear that the law is for today. What is sin? Sin is lawlessness. If there is no law, there is no sin. And even Paul says this. Paul says that, without the law, there is no sin. There is no transgression. That there is no transgression without the law, for it was by the law that there was sin. The knowledge of good and evil brought us the knowledge of the law. And in knowing that, we knew sin. Now, Paul also says, about us as believers and us being freed from the chains of the law, that we are no longer slaves to it, that we are no longer condemned by it. He does also say, does our justification mean that we are free, that we are no longer bound to obey the law? And he says, God forbid. So, in the teachings of James and Paul and the other apostles who helped write the New Testament by inspiration of God, we hear and read, about how much of the law is done away with, but how much of the law is not. And, God in the Old Testament, he stated that when his son had come, that those who would be saved by his son would have his law written in their hearts. A lot of the law was established in such a manner as to be covenantal. I don't believe that there is so much an old covenant, new covenant, as much as there is a alteration to the old covenant that freed us from certain aspects of it. Now, as far as which portions of the law we are to follow and which ones we no longer do, that's a matter of debate. In the Messianic community, they try to follow all of it. I don't personally believe that it is something that we are required to do today, but as Paul said, all aspects of the law are beneficial for us. They are all good for reproof. They are all good for teaching. And what is the tzitzit for? It's, when you're feeling tempted, you can reach down and feel that tzitzit and be reminded that you are God's. To be reminded of His commandments, of His law. To be reminded of what is right and what is wrong to do. And this is actually something that's taught in psychology. That, when you're stressed, you can use an object to de-stress you by applying a certain emotional memory or element to that object simply by looking at it or touching it can reverse an emotional stress in your life or in your mind at that time. Even churches, teach about, carrying a Bible with you or memorizing a verse so that when you feel tempted, you can read that Bible or memorize that or recite that verse over and over to overcome that temptation. That's basically what it was. A lot easier than having to recite a verse or pull out your Bible and read in public. You could just reach down and touch that tzitzit. Nice, instant. And I'm not a promoter of psychology at all, so do not get me wrong there. I do think that there are certain things that involve how the mind thinks, and it's good to learn from that. We can apply that to how we will live for God, but I don't believe at all in psychology itself as being something that we should focus on. As Scripture says, from out of the heart the mouth speaks. Who we are and what we are is in our heart. It's not in our mind. But the heart is also desperately wicked and deceitful above all things. Who can know it? The only people who can overcome that deceit of their heart are believers. And psychology is almost all of psychology has been developed by non-believers, individuals who can't overcome that deceit, which means that the deceit of the heart has deceived how psychology is formed. So I wouldn't put too much focus into psychology so much as in, learning how we think and in what ways we can use certain tools to overcome temptation. So, the tzitzit it's profitable for us because it teaches us that by having something on us that makes us think of God, think of His law, to think of purity. Even, the Bible teaches that all our thoughts should be pure and righteous, that our minds should always be on good, pure, righteous, holy thoughts. And when you do that, it is harder for temptation to come into your life. So, while I don't believe in the tzitzit as for today, I do recognize that, having something on you that you can use to overcome temptation is a very smart and intelligent thing. I'm still in the process of trying to develop for myself what I believe is still for today and what isn't. What is the law that God deemed to be institutionalized for that period only and what isn't. I'm not perfect. I'm sure that, there's some elements of what is still for today that I'm going to mistakenly categorize as done away with, and some things are done away with I'll probably categorize as being for today. In terms of being extremely cautious, there's only two things I really adapted into my life, and that's Sabbath and eating biblically clean. Both of those things were formed outside the law. The Sabbath was formed at the formation of creation. Before sin even entered into the world, the Sabbath was established. And in Ezekiel, the Sabbath is mentioned right there in prophecy for not only being instituted when Christ reigns for 1,000 years, but is also prophesied as continuing even after all the prophetic elements of Revelation is complete. So I see the Sabbath as a timeless command, one that's instituted with Adam and Eve before sin entered the world, that God even obeyed before man had a chance to be tempted. And something that's created before there was sin can't be bound as being part of the law. It's a timeless command. I am looking away a lot because I'm kind of watching to see if anybody shows up here. The way the reflection is on the windows, it's hard to see out there, so someone might just show up randomly, and I'll have to quickly pause this. Um, I don't keep the Sabbath perfectly. I've gone a long time with doing work on the Sabbath. I have an 11-month-old, a 22-month-old. We have a third child on the way. I'm a stay-at-home dad. My wife works. I'm probably not as efficient at house chores as my wife would be. So, by the time Friday rolls around and Friday evening comes, I am tired. I am usually very exhausted, and all I want to do is rest. So the Sabbath is, something I really look forward to. But, because, the house usually isn't great looking on the Sabbath, my wife and I do a lot of cleaning. My wife's views are different from mine. She doesn't, accept the Sabbath as being for today. She's definitely more on the Christian side of beliefs than I am, but she respects my beliefs and she's willing to do the Sabbath for me. But she would like a clean house on the weekend when she's home from work. So out of love, I do help with the cleaning of the house. If she has work that she needs to do from home, then I'll take on the cleaning and try to give her a chance to do her work. But the reason for that is because, as Christ said, that all of the law of the prophets and all the law itself was meant for love. It was all about love. It was all about teaching us to love those around us. It was all about teaching us to love God. And by the time Jesus walked the earth, the Jews had forgotten that. The Jews had institutionalized it as being what we today call legalism. And many churches, they only see the law in a legalistic fashion. Now, King David, King Solomon, all the wisest men of the Old Testament all referred to the law as being a blessing, as being wonderful. They all spoke of it as being, about wisdom. And they all spoke about how following it brought them closer to God. And this was because they didn't view it in the legalistic view. They saw it for what it was, love. And they followed it in the spirit of love. And that's what I try to do with the Sabbath. I follow it with the spirit of love. So, when I set aside I'm going to strictly follow it, so you're going to do your work and you're going to clean the house if you want the house clean. If I acted like that, that wouldn't be showing love to my wife. And, I have 2 kids. They need to see a father who shows love to his wife, who cares about her, who sacrifices for her. So, it's been a while since I've been able to keep the Sabbath perfectly. Today's going to be a little bit different because I will actually be able to keep it much closer to how it's intended to be held. I've sort of finally figured out a routine that seems to work pretty well for me. So the apartment's really clean. A couple things I didn't get to yesterday because my son managed to find chalk that had turned black and put markings all over our walls and his toys and doors and stuff while I was busy with our other son. But, when one of your children is in another room being perfectly quiet, and as far as you're aware, it's just toys in the room, you're more than happy to let him be satisfied. So it was quite exciting when I got to see him. I walked in and saw all the markings all over the walls. It was a fun time. And it was for him too. He was just laughing and giggling. But it took a long time to get those markings off. But just to get back to my point, the Sabbath was instituted outside the law. It was formed before there was sin. To attach it to the law of Moses is ludicrous, because God established it before there was even sin. So it's not a law that was intended to bind. And you may wonder, how could the Sabbath exist before sin? Work according to Christian churches, very often, work is something that is a result of sin. After all, Adam's punishment was that he would have to till the ground to feed his family, that he would have to work. That was part of Adam's sin punishment. But that's not entirely true. Adam had work before there was sin. His job was to tend to the garden. He tended to the plants. He tended to the animals. There was work before there was sin. Work is a good thing. We know that a person who doesn't have any form of work, whether mental or physical or otherwise, that individual tends to run into decay. Their bodies get weaker. Their mind gets weaker. They tend to get sick more often. So work is not a bad thing. It was instituted by God. God told Adam, these are your duties. And Adam abided by them. And on the seventh day, Adam got to rest. And the church will often refer to the Sabbath as being oppressive, as, the law is burdensome, and therefore we are free from the Sabbath. But what is burdensome about taking a day off from work? I don't know anybody who would turn down a day off from work unless doing so would hurt them financially, so much so that they couldn't pay their rent or feed their family. And then we fall right back into, it's about the spirit of love. If you have to work on the Sabbath to feed your family, to put a roof over their head, then that's what you do for your family. And when God opens up the opportunity for you to be able to supply for your family and keep the Sabbath, you take that up. But as long as you can't do that, you do what you have to do for your family, because it's not love to put your family out in the street. It's not love to have them go without food. And God cares about us. And God's not going to strike us down simply because we try to take care of our family. Now, if you're working on the Sabbath just for that extra paycheck, or just so you can afford that extra gift, that goes outside of the purview of love, that goes into sacrificing obedience to God for your own desire. It's your desire to get them a gift. It may be the gift that they desire most, but it's still you who's choosing to put God's law to the side for something that isn't even a necessity or important. Now, there's a lot of things that you hear about the Sabbath, about how it's to be followed, that makes it sound strict and burdensome, like you can't cook on the Sabbath. I cook on the Sabbath. When the Bible speaks about not cooking on the Sabbath, one of the things it specifically mentions is the making of bread. And, I considered it, what is the Sabbath? When we go back and we learn about how it's spoken of in its first mentioned, it's always about not working, not laboring, not stressing yourself. And it's later when, the baking of bread is given as an example. In the time that example was given, baking bread was done very differently than it is today. You had to gather the wheat. You had to pound it into flour. Then you would have to make your mixture. Kneading it and preparing it took hours. Then when you finally had the dough prepared, they had furnaces that they would have to cover the sides of the walls with ash from the fire burning inside. And then they'd have to slam the dough against the side of the wall of this furnace. When the bread was done, it would fall to the bottom. You would have to retrieve it. So you have to keep a very close eye on it the entire time, because you don't want it to overbake. You want to be there when it falls. There were no timers back then that automatically went off to let you know, hey, it's been 30 minutes or whatnot. So, then when it was done, you had to get it out. You'd have to clean the ash off the bread. You still had to clean the ash out of the oven itself. It was a very laborious process. Not that kneading bread isn't laborious even today, but it's certainly not to that extent. Me opening a packet of ramen noodles, adding water, microwaving it is not laborious. I set it to an automatic timer of 2 minutes. I walk away and don't even think about it. When it's done, the microwave stops on its own. If I get to it 10 minutes late, the noodles might be soggy, but it's still, I can still eat it. It's not burnt to a crisp or anything. And if I put something in the oven, I can set a timer that automatically tells me when it's done. I don't go through the process of cutting anything. I don't peel potatoes or carrots or anything like that unless, my children are hungry and we forgot to steam something for them. Then I'll probably peel some potatoes or some carrots and put them in our steamer. And our steamer automatically stops after a certain time. So, but that comes out of love. Having my children go hungry or making them eat something that's not healthy all day or junk food all day is not loving to them. So I do cook on Sabbath, but I do not cook anything that's going to be laborious or take any degree of preparation for. And that I believe follows the spirit of the law of the Sabbath, to not stress yourself, to not be laborious. We still have to eat. If I want something on Sabbath that is laborious to prepare, I'm going to make it the day before. It's not a violation of Sabbath, in my view, to just heat something up that's already been cooked and prepared. We are often told that, to cook at all is a sin according to the Bible for the Sabbath, but it's, in my view, it is not. And a lot of Messianics agree with me, and a lot of Messianics do take it to the extreme as well. But they do so out of love. They don't do it because they think they're going to go to hell if, they don't perfectly follow the law. If you believe that, then you have turned the law into legalism. And then that violates the grace and justification of Christ's blood. The following the law has to be out of love for God, that we follow the law because we love Him, not in order to gain salvation. There's a difference between salvation and eternal life, and that's for another video. I'm trying to hurry a little bit here because the amount of space I have on my phone is very low, so I have a very limited amount of time. That is the maximum amount of time I can record this for, so I only have a few more minutes before this thing's going to say that it will not save my video. And it'd be a real shame to go through all this and have the video not saved and have to redo it, as has happened to me once before. But other things, like not using electricity. It's not laborious for me to flip a switch. I try not to shop on the Sabbath unless, we really need something or my wife really wants something. My wife doesn't believe that the Sabbath is for today, so she really wants something on the Sabbath. I'll go and pick it up for her. That's my showing my love for her. She's willing to try to follow the Sabbath. I'm willing to meet her halfway, and so I love and respect that she loves and respects me. It doesn't show love if I'm being controlling. There is a time when a husband has to control his wife. Even Paul said so when he spoke to the church where the wives were being disruptive during church service, and he says, do you not have any control over your wives? The husband is the spiritual head of the house. There are times when, as a husband, for spiritual matters, you do need to put your foot down and say, no, it's going to be this way. Because the husband's the one who's going to be judged by God for how the house was run, not the wife. The wife holds no spiritual responsibility whatsoever in that regard. The husband does. And a wife who tries to control the home is a wife who has no respect for her husband and how he's going to be judged. A wife needs to be his source of wisdom, his knowledge and understanding. She needs to be his advisor. But the second she starts being the one who makes all the decisions and forces him to abide by her decisions, is the second she doesn't really love or care about him anymore. It's all about herself. Because she has decided that, even though he's going to be judged now for her decisions rather than judged on his own. And that's not loving on a wife's side, but it's also not loving on a husband's side to be controlling in the family, to control every decision and to not listen to his wife's advice. It's unloving for a husband not to do something he disagrees with for the sake of his wife. And, a husband has to do that. A husband has to say, look, I really feel this way, but I know you feel this way. And I know you feel about it very strongly, more strongly than I feel about my view. And so I'm going to do this for you. Unless it really goes against Scripture. A loving husband has to be prepared to do that. God did that in the Old Testament where he felt one way, but, because a man begged him, he changed his view. And in the long term, it did cause us harm, but, he showed his love for man, that he was willing to change what he was going to do for man. It shows his love for us. I mean, a God that has created us, that has the right to control us, loved us so much that he would compromise with us. I mean, that's loving. And a husband has to be the same way. I've only got about 3 minutes before this reaches its maximum. So anyway, to be quick, there's nothing wrong with using electricity on the Sabbath, in my view. Nothing wrong with driving your car. Nothing wrong with going to the park. Nothing wrong with cooking, as long as you're not doing laborious processes to do it. The Sabbath is supposed to be for our rest. It is supposed to be fun. It is supposed to be a time to spend with family and friends who share the love of Christ. It is supposed to be a feast. It is meant to be wonderful. It is supposed to be a day we look forward to. And that's how Messianics often view the Sabbath, as a day to look forward to. They look forward to not working that day. They look forward to resting, to being with family and friends. And that's what it's for. It's in psychology, it's also taught that people are far more willing to separate from their money than they are from their time or their hobbies. And that's what we have here. We have, an instituted tithing of time and an instituted tithing of finances. And nowhere in the New Testament is tithing of money ever deemed a command or requirement. There are, all throughout the Old Testament, promises made to those who choose to tithe for God. But in the New Testament, there is no requirement for it that I have ever come across, or anybody I've ever talked to has been able to come across or sufficiently prove. There's lots of, if we imply this or interpret it this way, but nothing that specifically says that you must tithe in the New Testament. And yet it is taught as a command in the church. But then we have an actual command for tithing our time to God that exists before there was sin in the world. And we choose to see it as burdensome to take a time off from work and spend with our family, to pray to God and to play games with our children, to sit around a table and tell our children how much we love them. And I think it's very sad. I think it's very unloving to your own family when you can say taking a day off from work is burdensome to me. And I think that's very sad. But so anyway, I just wanted to do this quick video. I just got this little notification, something about the maximum video limit size, even though I haven't reached it according to this other thing showing on my phone. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video now and really hope that this saves. But I was going to include a Sabbath prayer in this video. It's something I do want to do on the Sabbath from now on. I'm going to try to do a Sabbath video every Sabbath, but it may or may not happen. So let me go ahead and end this video before I reach my maximum too closely. God bless you all. Enjoy this day with your family and friends. And really consider, how valuable your time is and those who are most important to you that you want to spend that time with. All right.